Welcome back, everyone. So our next speaker is Marcus Schrenk over Zoom from Duesseldorf, and he'll be talking to us about mind-body property dualism's ontological consequences. Take it away, Marcus.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for organizing this event and having me as a speaker. It's good to see you all or meet you all, even if not in person. I hope you can hear me well. I assume that this is the case until I hear otherwise. My talk is about mind-body property dualism and how to make sense of it within the general metaphysics of properties. That is, how we can implement a mind-body property dualism into nominalism or universals or tropes theory. Now, before I start, 3 autobiographical notes. The first one is, I'm not a property dualist. Secondly, I began sharing these ideas already in 2022 at Berlin, in Berlin at Freie Uni. And at that point, I was completely unaware that David and Daniel already have a brilliant paper on a similar topic. And to make matters even worse, for the past 3 years I've been immersed in science administration and still haven't had the time to fully explore their articles. So sorry about that. I hope this will change as of today. And my last remark is, unfortunately, I've come down with a terrible cold. I'm trying to hold out until after my talk, but apologies especially to the speakers later today that I might have to leave the conference for the rest of the day. Okay, now some stage setting. Mind-body dualism comes in different varieties. The 3 main contenders are substance dualism, property dualism, and predicate dualism. Now, substance dualism claims that there are 2 different kinds of substances, physical stuff and mental stuff. Descartes' res extensa and res cogitans are examples of a substance dualism. A property dualism postulates 2 distinct kinds of properties, mental properties and physical properties. It is possible to defend property dualism without also subscribing to substance dualism. So the very same neutral, if you so wish, substance may instantiate both mental and physical properties. And this property dualism combined with substance monism is the dualism I'm concerned with in my talk. But I want to focus lastly on predicate dualism, the theory that says that there are merely 2 important linguistic or conceptual ways to classify the world. To fully describe the world, one needs 2 predicate types, physical and mental predicates, where it is impossible to define the mental predicates in terms of physical predicates. Now, predicate dualism claims there is no ontological difference in the world, right? It's just a conceptual thing. But this is what property dualism, the view I'm concerned with, claims. Here's a quote by Howard Robinson. Here is a quote by, where's the quote by? Here's the quote by Howard Robinson. Whereas predicate dualism says that there are 2 essentially different kinds of predicates in our language, property dualism says that there are 2 essentially different kinds of property out in the world. And here's something important. For property dualism not to collapse into predicate dualism, there needs to be an ontological mental-physical divide. Not only a difference in description, there has to be an ontological difference maker that must also somehow leave its mark within the general property ontology one subscribes to. Here again, Howard Robinson saying an ontological difference maker, something more than was allowed for in the initial ontology. Now, here's then this talk's task. Mind-body property dualism is a specific ontological stance about properties. However, how does it fit into general property ontologies? More concretely, how can nominalism, universals, and trope theory accommodate the ontological difference maker that has to be demanded by property dualists? That's my task. Now I start with nominalism, and here, to make my point, the austere class nominalism, okay, where properties are nothing but sets of neutral possibilia. In fact, all eligible sets of possibilia are, within that theory, supposed to be properties, or abundant properties at least. There are clear individuation criteria for such nominalistic properties. They are sets, and sets are individuated by their members. Thus, some allegedly mental property is certainly different from some allegedly physical property if they have different members. However, that difference alone does not amount to the ontological gap that makes the divide mental-physical any larger or more discriminatory than intra-realm differences. An allegedly physical property is distinguished from another physical property by the very same criteria, namely set membership. The set's members, as they are and so are mental properties, of course, different from other mental properties because they will have different members. But that's not a difference enough, because the differences between mental, physical, mental are just of the same kind. There's not the ontological difference maker we need to ask for as a property dualist. So therefore the question arises on which further ontological grounds the initially assumed division in mental properties and physical properties can be made. For property dualism, there has to be a further ontological ground. Now here's a futile attempt. You could stipulate a second-order set binding all first-order sets or properties that are supposedly mental and respectively with the physical properties, and call it the mental or physical properties. Now, why is this no solution for the property dualist? Because within abundant nominalism, these sets exist anyway. Sets are abundant, they already exist. To put it in another way, you cannot opt in or out of this pseudo-property dualism. There is no nominalist universe that allegedly incorporates this property dualism and a nominalist universe that does not. They all incorporate it. So either property dualism is a necessary component of abundant nominalism because you have these higher order sets, or rather abundant nominalism does not have the resources to incorporate property dualism in a meaningful way. Now, intuitively, nominalism seems anyway not to be a natural ally for property dualism, just an intuition of mine. However, there is indeed, of course, there is a nominalism that does have the resources to incorporate the necessary ontological gap. And I do this with David Lewis, who is not a property dualist, but here's how it goes. Postulate, analogously to David Lewis's perfectly natural properties, that there is a primitive objective difference between the natural mental and the natural physical properties, just by fiat, as Lewis did it, or as an abductive step, inference to the best explanation. So the mental and the physical properties would be two elite special classes of properties within the abundance of properties, whose members are maybe naturally, primitively of a mental or respectively physical nature. So a fundamental real distinction between mental and the physical has been been introduced, at least by a fiat that might be an abductive step by the property dualist. So it is possible to implement it into nominalism. I move on to universals theory, because be it as it may be, for nominalism, my guess is that property dualists will despite the Lewis-style possibility that is here on offer, that a property dualist has the tendency to subscribe to a more robust theory of properties. It would seem that a universals theory is better equipped to implement the required ontological distinction. So this is why I come now to universals. And here I focus on the universals view of sparse universals. So in a first step towards the implementation of property dualism into a universals theory of properties, let's postulate that there are both sparse physical as well as sparse mental universals. But to merely say this, that there are mental universals on top of physical ones, is not enough. Again, there has to be an ontological difference maker, for otherwise the mental universals are no more different amongst each other than they are different to the physical ones. Again, they have to differ more than just in between the groups, so to speak. So the metaphysical gulf has to be bigger than just the individuation criteria for the different universals. And again, a second order universal, similar to Lewis's postulation, comes in handy. So here's a theoretical addendum to sparse universals theory that is, again, inspired from the debate about laws of nature, an area where also Lewis's postulation of the existence of perfectly natural properties came from, namely the opponent or David Lewis's discussion partner in this area, David Armstrong. David Armstrong postulated a primitive second order relational universal, N necessitation, that relates first order universals. And if and only if NFG, then it is a law of nature that F's are G's. Now this is just background, but we can stipulate a second order universal and second order universals. And so the property dualist too can accept such sparse fundamental second order universals and make use of them. So let P and M be two, now one place, sparse fundamental second order universals, namely being physical and being mental. First order universals can now be said to have either of these two primitive fundamental second order universals, and property dualism finds its ontological grip within a universals ontology. So again, this is by fiat, but if you ask for a... so my question was, if you ask, as a property dualist does, for an ontological difference, then you have to implement this ontological difference into your overall theory of properties, and this is the way a universals theorist could do so with the help of Armstrong's second order universals. Now, for tropes, I suppose there are similar resources to implement property, i.e. trope dualism, just in the very same way, and I won't focus on it much, so just briefly here, define two fundamental resemblance tropes, for example, PR and MR, that sort all the tropes into two distinct classes. Again, of course, a move by fiat, but I just want to show that there is a possibility to do that for these general theories of properties. And I leave the tropes idea here rudimentary for the sake of brevity. So here's an intermediate summary. Different general metaphysical theories of properties have different resources to implement an ontological gap that is necessary for mind-property dualism, and that tells it apart from mere predicate dualism. I have indicated which resources the nominalist and the universals theorist could adopt, and I have briefly mentioned a strategy for the tropes theorist. Note something striking, however, something that might have worried you all along. These strategies indicated so far are not only ad hoc in a way, but I just wanted to show the possibility of them. They concentrate on an ontological demarcation that is somewhat extrinsic to the mental and the physical properties. They have received their mentalness or physicalness from that external difference maker. These postulated difference makers, to quote Howard Robinson again, were quite literally something more, something on top, something external that was allowed for in the initial ontology. Yet, maybe we were on the wrong track. So proof of concept or proof of possibility is there, I hope, but maybe we were on the wrong track and have to look inside the properties, so to speak. And you guess where this is heading. What about the hallmark of the mental, intentionality, right? So might not it be the needed ontological difference maker, yet internal to the properties, and you don't need an external difference maker? Or what about the phenomenal character of the mental does not lie here, internally the difference maker asked for? Now, of course, that might well be so. But note that these new features will also have to find their place within the general theories of properties. So how are phenomenal nominalist properties? What about phenomenal universals? It's intentional universals, intentional nominalist properties. So again, we have to ask how these internal markers, hallmarks of the mental and physical find their way into our general ontology of nominalism, universals, and trope theory. And this will be the task of the next two and final sections. I start with intentionality. So let us first suppose with Brentano that intentionality is the internal hallmark of the mental. Brentano, and so might today's dualist, took this to mean that everything mental is intentional, but nothing physical is, i.e. intentionality is both necessary and sufficient for the mental. Here's the quote we all know: every mental phenomenon includes something as object within itself. In presentation, something is presented. In judgment, something is affirmed or denied. In love, and so on. The intentional is characteristic exclusively of mental phenomena. No physical phenomenon exhibits anything like it. We can therefore define mental phenomena by saying that they are those phenomena which contain an object intentionally within themselves. Okay. Now, let us agree, for the sake of the argument, that the ontological demarcation needed lies indeed in the mental properties intentionality. And no further extrinsic ontological difference maker, as discussed in the previous sections, is needed. Okay. However, as I just said, this does not exempt us from answering the question previously asked, namely, can nominalist properties, can universals, can tropes accommodate the intentionality of mental properties? This again is the question whether general theories of properties can accommodate this now internal, additional ontological difference maker. Now, here's the place where I can't go into much detail, but I want to show why this is problematic, but also indicate at least where solutions might be found. So, note first striking similarities between intentionality and another feature properties might have, namely dispositionality. And of course, with George Molnar, they have been identified or put close together. Here's what Molnar says, for example, about psychological states. Psychological states and mental properties are directed to something beyond themselves. Well, they are intentionality, right? Physical properties, such as solubility or electromagnetic charge, also have that direction towards something outside themselves. That is typical of psychological attributes. Now, these properties, dispositional powers and/or psychological states, have an object towards they are oriented or directed. Okay. Now, let me mention another similarity. Dispositionality and intentionality have also in common that they create internal differences. Dispositional properties are different from categorical properties just because of what they are in themselves. And it would be kind of absurd to ask for further external difference maker or demarcation criterion as I asked in the first part of the talk. So far, so good. Now, because of the similarity shared between dispositionality and intentionality, both dispositionality and intentionality bring with them, another quote by Molnar, an intentional property can exist whether its intentional object exists or not. A purely physical object can be soluble without ever dissolving, or fragile without ever breaking. In other words, the second relatum, stimulus manifestation, the manifestation relatum might not exist ever exist in the real world. So that means trouble for the general metaphysics of properties within dispositionality. This fact that dispositional properties point to or are directed to a further object, a further property, manifestation property, even one that may not exist, this difficulty has been perceived when it comes to incorporating it into nominalist, universals, or tropes ontologies. So there is literature on the difficulty to put dispositional ontology into nominalism, universals theory, and tropes theory. So the same difficulties arise there analogously, and we can take them maybe as solutions for the intentionality problem. So why is it problematic? Here's a very brief outline of the problem by Matt Tugby. Directedness or aboutness is often conceived as a relation. However, if the disposition's manifestation never comes about or the intentional object does not exist, then the second relatum is missing. Yet relations only exist insofar as they relate one thing to another. So either directedness is not a relation after all, or the second relatum does somehow exist after all, or there's some other way around. Yeah? But we need to find an answer here. So how do we solve this puzzle for nominalist properties? How are they directed and maybe to non-existent entities? How tropes, how universals? And we indeed get solutions for dispositionality of these, for these theories of properties. So regarding dispositionalism and categoricalism, there seems to be, oh sorry, I'm ahead of myself. Let's start with this slide again. Regarding dispositionalism and categoricalism, there seems to be the following intuitive allegiances. Nominalism seems to go well with categoricalism, David Lewis and the empiricists. And dispositionalism seems to go with universals, so Bird's theory and Tugby's theory. So this is just a note aside. So maybe we expect that also for a physicalist theory will go for nominalism, or property dualism might go for universals theory just as well. So just as a side remark in the background. Now let me at least gesture towards solutions for dispositionality that are available on the market for universals theory, for nominalism, and for tropes theory. In case of dispositionality, detailed and fruitful discussions have begun and are ongoing, and if intentionality is alike dispositionality in this crucial respect, then much can be learned from the arguments surrounding dispositionality. And in fact, Matt Tugby claims that Platonic universals are best suited to be dispositional. Why is that? Well, because for Platonic universals, the lacking object, the manifestation property, in never manifesting dispositions may still exist, namely as unmanifested Platonic universals. So there you would find also the directedness for intentional properties. That would be fine if those directed at properties are within the Platonic realm. Now, Molnar himself, who compared intentionality and dispositionality, believes that dispositions that point beyond themselves are best conceived of as tropes. Here is chapters where he writes about this. I have to confess, so far I haven't understood his arguments, so I need to go back into that. But there is an argument there. And lastly, and maybe surprisingly, in ingenious ways, Anne Whittle and Lisa Vogt have argued that even nominalism is suitable for dispositionalism. Intuitively, I find that it's strange to see how they can point outside themselves nominalistic properties, but there is literature on a solution to that. Now, I do not want to rehearse or judge these arguments here. I just want to point out to the mind-body properties dualist who conceives of intentionality of the mental as the ontological demarcation criterion for mental versus physical properties, that in these contributions of Vogt, Tugby, etc., solutions might also be found for the task to build intentionality into a general properties theory. So these are possibilities for solutions. Now, for reasons of time, I skip this summary and come to the phenomenal character as the hallmark of the mental. So intentionality is not the only intrinsic hallmark of the mental. We were looking for an ontological difference maker. I offered a couple of external ones. I offered an internal one, namely intentionality, but it's not the only internal one. The phenomenal character of the mental is another contender. And I consider it also, but only briefly, and offer some intuitions here. So what's this phenomenal character? Earlier this morning by Christian, we have heard about it, of course, already. But here's again a summary by Chalmers. The subjective quality of experience. A number of alternative terms and phrases pick out that quality. These include experience, qualia, phenomenology, the phenomenal, subjective experience, the what it is like, etc. To be mental in this sense is roughly synonymous with to have qualia, to have subjective experience, and so on. Okay, so that's where one would claim as a properties dualist the metaphysical gulf lies between the physical and the mental. So let us agree now that the ontological demarcation needed lies in the mental properties phenomenality. And no further extrinsic difference maker is needed. However, yet again, this does not exempt us from answering the question previously asked, namely, how can nominalist properties, universals, tropes accommodate the phenomenality of mental properties? This time, the intuitive ally to the phenomenal is, I believe, intuitively nominalism. Sets of tokens of phenomenal experiences would be the respective properties. Sets of tokens of phenomenal experience would be the properties within nominalism. Think analogously of the logical empiricist sense data. Empiricism was inclined towards nominalism, right? So it seems that nominalism is an ally here for phenomenal experiences or phenomenal properties. Likewise, I guess, and I leave this very brief, as in the previous sections, it is easier to see how there could be phenomenal tropes, I take it. However, I find it harder to see how universals could capture the phenomenal character of mental properties. While maybe their tokens or instantiations could be said to have phenomenal content, I find it hard to conceive how universals themselves, i.e. these abstract entities in their own right, have phenomenal content. Mind you, the instantiations are perfect copies, platonically speaking, are perfect copies of the universals in Platonic heaven. So also the universals in Platonic heaven should have a phenomenal feel to themselves. So, as I said, this is especially hard to see for Platonist transcendent version, i.e. for universals that exist independent of anything else, especially independent of any sentient creature. Intuitively then, the phenomenal and the intentional, as intrinsic hallmark of the mental, seem to have opposite allies within the orthodox general theories of properties. The phenomenal goes well with nominalism and possibly tropes, the intentional more naturally with universals, because they can point outside themselves to other universals, it seems. Okay, so intuitively then, the phenomenal and the intentional as intrinsic hallmarks of the mental seem to have opposite allies. Sorry, I had that already, right? So I jump to my overall summary already and come to an end. Mind-body property dualists postulate two different kinds of properties, mental properties and physical properties. As opposed to mere predicate dualism, there must be an ontological difference maker for these two different ontological kinds. And this difference maker, whether external or internal, doesn't matter, must be accommodated by the general metaphysics of properties one holds. And I have offered or pointed to or gestured to, as I said, this is unfinished business. I have offered solutions, pointed to solutions for nominalisms, universals, and tropes theories, and some of them manage better with some suggestions than others. Thank you, that's it already. Thanks for listening.